Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 68th episode of Facebook Live for the Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndrome Foundation, the SADS Foundation. And on behalf of Alice Laura, the CEO of the SADS Foundation, it's great to have you with us today. I missed you last week. Well, we all missed each other because we moved to every other week. I hope for those in the United States, you had a wonderful 4th of July. We hear lots, don't we, about America and the state of the United States of America. I'll just put out there for you my view. This is an amazing country. I'm so thankful to have the privilege of living in the United States. Perfect country, of course not. Problems, of course, but still one of the greatest countries on the planet. And so Independence Day is very special to many of us who take great pride in getting to be an American. Well, I'm glad to have you back and to join us. We're going to have a really interesting, provocative, exciting conversation today with a dear friend, Dr. Rachel Lampert from Yale University. And before I bring Dr. Lampert on to join me, just to remind us that as we are in our 68th episode together, almost every Friday for over a year, and many of you are regulars, and I see Ellie joining us from Dublin, and Melissa coming on. So it's great to have so many regulars back. And I've learned from many of you that you watch every Friday and now every other Friday, but you never say anything on the chat line. And so many of my patients across the globe are watching as well. And so great to have you. The pandemic, yep, it's still here. 186 million cases worldwide. We just crossed 4 million deaths globally. In the United States, we're closing in on 34 million cases. We passed 606,000 deaths. In our own county here, where Mayo Clinic resides in Minnesota, we've had 13,000 cases and 102 deaths for a death rate of under 1%, 0.75%. So for the most part, this virus, SARS-CoV-2, is not lethal. It certainly has demonstrated its lethality across the globe, but in high-risk individuals. As we've said for over a year now, are you at high risk because you have one of our genetic heart conditions, whether it's long QT, CPVT, Brugada? I've said it over and over again. The evidence is still the same. No, you are not at high risk. That's good news. So even though the death rate in a low-risk person is really, really low, it's not zero, and we need to globally get to herd immunity in our countries as fast as we can, and thankfully in warp speed, we have incredibly efficacious vaccines from several companies. The Pfizer vaccine, that's what I got. The Moderna vaccine, that's what my wife got. And the Johnson & Johnson single-shot vaccine are the three most common in the United States. They're approved in the United States for Pfizer down to age 12. The studies for under age 12 are ongoing, and some of us anticipate approval end of 2021 for sort of the age 6 and older. So stay tuned for that. So all things considered, get vaccinated. I still have not seen anything that changes the risk-benefit equation away from vaccination. A lot of noise out there. No change. I agree with the CDC. More importantly, I agree with Mayo Clinic. Get vaccinated. Tell your friends to get vaccinated. After you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear these as often. I still have to wear them in the plane unless they reverse that plane mask mandate. So wear them in the plane. Don't get kicked off like the passenger from last week. A pretty interesting experience for my wife and I, besides us almost getting attacked by a knifer in Seattle, another conversation. But do all the right things and get vaccinated. And we can do this. The Delta strain has taken over. It's the single most common SARS-CoV-2 variant now, the Delta strain in the United States, over half of the cases. But get this, in one of the states, I think it's Maryland, in the month of June, of all of their COVID deaths, everyone were in unvaccinated individuals. So it used to be those who had a COVID-19 death were obese, old, hypertensive. Now the single most common unifier for I have COVID and I died from COVID is I am not vaccinated. So do it. No, that's enough of pandemic. Now to what we really want to focus our 35 minutes on together, and that is this fascinating topic of the coexistence of athleticism, an implantable defibrillator, and the presence of genetic heart diseases that may predispose to sudden death. Who says that that person can't play anyway? That's a title of lectures that I give across the globe. And to help us unpack this whole topic, Aaron's going to bring in Dr. Rachel Lampert from Yale University. Dr. Lampert, welcome.
Hi, Mike. How are you? Hi, Dr. Ackerman.
I'm great. So we talk behind the scenes, and so if it's okay with the audience, I'll be Mike, and Dr. Lampert will be Rachel, if that's okay with everyone.
Absolutely.
Great. Rachel, great to see you.
Great to see you, Mike. So happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be on this broadcast and talk to the SADS community.
It's a pleasure. And besides being a really special person in my life and a friend, everyone, Rachel and I are co-investigators on LIVE. And many of you have participated in LIVE HCM. More on this call, LIVE Long QT. And we'll get to LIVE and the state of that NIH-funded study. But before we get to that, Rachel, let everybody in on a little bit of your life journey. How did you get to this place of adult EP anyway? And then I'll ask you how it turned towards a particular passion about athletes.
So I'm a cardiologist, and I'm a specialist in electrophysiology or arrhythmias. And I did my training here at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, and stayed on to become an instructor and then an assistant professor. Now I've been here for a while, as you can see, and I'm a full professor now here at Yale.
And during that time, you did the typical internal medicine, adult cardiology, adult electrophysiology, but at some point in your career, you took a particular interest in your patients who were an athlete, wanted to be an athlete, were told, sorry, your athletic days are done. When did that all happen in your journey?
So I think the most important research questions, this really started with wanting to help out my patients. So pretty early on in my career, I was maybe like 2-3 years out of fellowship, just starting as an attending. I had 2 patients within a short period of time. One was a young man who played high school ice hockey, and we had found that he had passed out. We found he had non-sustained ventricular tachycardia, ultimately diagnosed with a mild cardiomyopathy. And with this constellation of symptoms, we had given him a defibrillator. Around the same time, I had another patient, a little bit older, a young adult, who did competitive speed skating and bicycling. And although he was out of college, he was still very involved in these types of competitions. Very similar story, had a syncopal event, found to have ventricular tachycardia, ended up with a defibrillator. So, at that time, as you know, this was now, I'm going to date myself, but this is now around not even 2000, this was around 1998 probably. And as you know, at that time, there were guidelines that said patients with defibrillators should not do sports more vigorous than golf or bowling. And so I said, particularly to the little bit older man, the man that was the young adult, I said, well, I'm really sorry, but this is the guidelines, so you're going to have to stop doing all of this competition. And so he said to me, he was not a medical person, but he said to me, well, what's the data on that? And I said, well, there really isn't any data, but that's what the experts say. And he said, well, you get me data and then I'll make up my mind. And I was like, wow, that's that's a great question. And so from that point, I started thinking about, I was pretty young, but I started thinking about how are we going to get that data one way or the other. I wasn't particularly looking to find one answer or the other. I just wanted to know what the data showed.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think of 1998 and where we were in our field and where I was even, but just how it was inspired by a patient, and so many of our patients and families who joined us, if they only knew how many of our papers were because of them and because of the questions that they asked in the office and said, why? I don't get that. That doesn't make sense to me. Show me the data. I think our families, they deserve a lot of credit. Let me add, Rachel, here, at that time, I did the same thing. My time when I intersected with you back then wasn't really patient driven. It was just my own curiosity. So as you know, I joined Mayo Clinic staff in 2000. So I was a fellow in 98, that time period. And as I was seeing this whole issue, I kept finding myself raising my hand like Tom Hanks in the movie Big. I love that scene where he raises his hand at the little kid and says, I don't get it. I don't get it. Why are we doing it this way? And it just seemed so contrarian to me that we were taking a position of, if in doubt, kick you out. And that kind of was the law of the land, it seemed like, on my arrival onto staff, was an incredibly restrictive predisposition that unless your heart was perfect, we were telling them, or we were told that we should be telling them, Johnny, Sally, you're disqualified from everything, basically. And then at the same time, I then see this Dr. Lampert, who is starting this thing called ICD in Sports Registry. And I thought, wow, that's really, really bold, because if athletes with heart disease can't do anything, how can it be possible that an athlete with defibrillator? I loved it. But at that time, the notion of an athlete with an ICD staying an athlete was like oil and water. It doesn't mix. So what was that like when you decided, as pretty young in your career, to kind of go pretty bold and start something that was a bit blasphemous, if I might say, an ICD Sports Registry?
Well, we did start with an sort of an intermediate step. So the first thing, through raising my hand, very similar and asking questions, I met another colleague, Brian Olshansky, at a meeting. And we started talking about how can we start to get data about this and actually know the answer to this question. Is it safe or is it not? And what we did at first, the very first thing we did was actually a survey of members of the Heart Rhythm Society. And we just asked them, we didn't try to get too detailed. We just said, do you have patients with ICDs in your practice doing sports? Are they doing competitive sports? Are they doing contact sports? And have you had any bad outcomes? And quite a few wrote back that despite the recommendations at the time, plenty of their patients were doing sports. They were doing competitive sports. They were doing contact sports. Sometimes it was with the doctor's recommendations. Sometimes they just were off doing it, regardless. But one way or the other, they were doing it. And so what that told us was that we could do a prospective registry. We could identify those patients and enroll them in a registry without having them do something, that would be against recommendations. We were going to just follow them, people who had already made the decision to do it already. And so that was how basically we launched the ICD Sports Registry. We said, we know these people are out there. There's defibrillator patients. They're out there doing sports. And so we're going to try to identify them and follow them prospectively and see how they're doing.
And that's kind of interesting. I can't help but interject from a comment from Dana, who follows us regularly from Ireland. And Dana, someday I'm going to get back to Dublin, but she goes, "Wow, that's great." She wanted data to back up a treatment plan. So kind of what a concept, having data to guide us. But then Dugan adds, he's 16, he or she. I'm not going to assume he just because of rodeo, but let's say maybe he. Sudden cardiac arrest in October after roping at rodeo, got a defibrillator, started back roping. 4 months later in rodeo, has a pace guard to protect my ICD during rodeo. So for Dugan, Dr. Lampert back at that time, she wasn't saying, yes, you may, no, you may not. She was just receiving people who already were staying athletes, despite the official law of the land. And so what was it like then, Rachel, when you launched the prospective registry, in terms of interest in signing up, Any negative naysayers saying, what on earth do you think you're doing, Dr. Lampert?
Well, there were some people in the environment, in the medical community, who felt that by having the registry, we were sort of encouraging sports. But we really did make it very clear to the people that joined the study that we were not endorsing sports, that we weren't endorsing it or not endorsing it. We were just saying, you're doing it, and we want to see how things are going with you. And so I think that we really did do this in a way that sort of was, agnostic. It didn't take a stand. It just said, we're going to observe. And that's what really science is. It's observing the world around you. And so we said, we're going to observe in a systematic way those people who are doing sports. And so, as you know, we did ultimately find over 400 people doing a variety of different sports, variety of different levels, from the little league to high school kids. We had college kids, we had adults doing marathons, and really all different kinds of sports and all different kinds of people eventually enrolled.
And what did we learn?
So what we learned was that things seemed to be going okay. So we did have a fair number of people who did receive shocks. They received shocks when they were doing their sports. They received shocks when they were doing other sorts of activities, maybe just walking or mowing the lawn. And they received shocks at rest. And while it was more likely that people would receive shocks when they were active than when they were, say, sleeping, although people do sometimes get shocks sleeping. There was really no difference between doing sports and not doing sports. And so what this told us was, and I'm sorry, I should give you the main results. So we found that while people did get shocks, really the defibrillator always worked. So for the vast majority of the time, it worked with the very first shock. And occasionally people needed more than one shock, but it was very rare, actually, that happened. And we found there weren't any injuries. I think one thing that had concerned people was that a patient with a defibrillator would, go up for a jump shot or whatever. The device would go off, they'd fall on someone else. But we just really didn't see that happen. It doesn't mean it could never happen, but it certainly, we can say with a good degree of confidence that it's not frequent. That basically in our study, we really didn't have any injuries. We had no failures to defibrillate. And so what that told us is that for many people, playing sports with an ICD is safe.
And that was a really, really encouraging pronouncement at the time. And you made out the point, Rachel, that you were agnostic. You were not proposing or endorsing or disqualifying. You were just taking them as they came.
Right.
At that same time, somebody who you know well, called yours truly, did take a different stance. I went, as they say, rogue, because I felt that it was fundamentally wrong in the year 2000 when I joined the staff, that the way we were doing it, of disqualifying everybody left and right. And the reason why I quickly abandoned that majority opinion or majority position is I started to see one person after another with genetic heart disease A, B, C, D, whether it's long QT, CPVT, HCM, who went from being a really great kid, great adult, male or female, and then became train wrecks after their disqualification, where they went to the dark side of life, or they gained a lot of weight, or their grades went from A's to D's. And I said, we have got to do better than this. Who says they can't play? Maybe we can, maybe the correct answer can be and should be, yes, you can play. And so while your ICD registry took a hit from some people of saying, why are you having that? I definitely have some hits and bruises to show from being the person really who might have started the new idea of what you and I now call shared decision making, where we actually, as the physician, respect the patient and their family's right to make a well-informed decision. And then, in fact, I do, if I feel confident and comfortable in the treatment plan, I do endorse I fully support their return to play. So What was that like for you, observing sort of this slow movement where you and I were clearly in the minority position to where I'm not sure we're quite in a majority position now, where the majority think like we do, but it's growing a lot, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that there's really two things that have led to that change and that evolution. One is the data. We have our ICD Sports Registry. You've published a lot of data from your own population that shows these kids with long QT and adults with long QT are playing sports and doing okay. Our ongoing study, LIVE, I think we'll talk about more, is still in progress. But the data really are developing from these other avenues, even as LIVE is still progressing. And I think that's one important piece of this. The other important piece is this kind of concept, as you mentioned, of shared decision making, that risk is not like 100% or 0%. There's risk in lots of things we do in life. We get in a car, we choose lots of things. Some people climb Mount Everest, and people think differently about risk, and that's okay. And so the fact that we can talk about, well, something might not be risk-free, but lots of things in life aren't risk-free. And this is a decision that you and your family can make together. And so I think that concept, and that's actually expanding throughout other aspects of medicine too, sort of how we think about procedures in general and what's the right course for your medical care in general. But I think you applying that concept to decision-making for athletes with cardiovascular disease really has been more radical, and I think has helped move this field forward.
And definitely. And we've mentioned LIVE a couple times, and I just want Deirdre to know, I noticed your question on the sidebar. I'm not going to miss it at all. I'm going to come to it for the last few minutes because it gets to, Rachel, does this approach fit for every athlete with every kind of disease? But we won't go there quite yet because we'll come back to LIVE, because Dana is asking the question from Ireland that her daughters and Dana herself participated for 3 years in the LGTS study, which ended for them January 2021, and saying, so you are happy with the results from that study? Well, Dana, I'm not quite sure. Well, we're always happy, number one. About the results of the study, we're can't quite reveal that part, but let's reveal to everybody, Rachel, the genesis of LIVE. What is this thing called LIVE LQTS and LIVE HCM anyway? And what do we know so far from all of the people like Dana and her girls who participated?
So I felt like after we got the data from the ICD Sports Registry, it had answered such an important question about the safety of sports for people with ICDs, but it actually left us almost a bigger question, which is, what about the safety of sports for people who aren't felt to be at such high risk of having a cardiac arrest that they need an ICD, but the current guidelines were restricting those people as well. So the next step really had to be getting data about everybody with these types of genetic cardiovascular diseases, not just the ones with ICDs, but really all people along the spectrum of the genetic cardiovascular diseases. So we started with long QT and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy as the most common genetic electrical disease and most common disease of the heart muscle. To do another type of prospective study. It was similar to the ICD registry, but actually a little bit different in that we started out to follow everyone. So we enrolled people who had one of these two heart conditions, regardless of level of activity. So we enrolled whether you like to read a book, whether you were actually playing sports, whether you just like to go for a jog once in a while. We enrolled people at all levels of activity to evaluate whether those who were more active are going to have more arrhythmias than those who are less active. And we actually hypothesized the answer being no, that the risk would not be higher. When you do a study, you don't want to influence the study in one direction or the other, but you still have a hypothesis of what you are, you think you might find. And so that was how we set this study up. So at this point, we finished enrollment actually a couple years ago. And we're really in the phase now of trying to collect the final data. So some people have finished their 3 years. Some people if people want to continue, we can actually continue even longer than 3 years. There's some people, if any of you are out there, there's some people that we kind of lost track over. They kind of lost track of us, and we're still hoping you'll find us, because if there's anybody out there who was in it and we have lost contact with you, it would be great to get back in touch with us, because we're at a stage now where we're really trying to really get the final information on how everyone did over these years. And we're hoping to be finished with the data collection, hopefully by the end of this year. So maybe by early next year, we'll really start to have an answer.
And is this data from 20 or 30 people who enrolled with LQTS and HCM, or what kind of? I think it's good for them to know that this is for our field, as they say, a whopper of a study.
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, we enrolled over 1,500 people with each condition. So we have over 1,500 people with long QT, and actually over 2,000 with HCM. So we're really going to have a large population to get this information from. So thank you so much to all the people who did enroll in the study. We're really looking forward to getting the answers pretty soon.
We mentioned, Rachel, guidelines, that the guidelines from the various cardiac societies have been very restrictive. Unless your heart's perfect, sorry, Charlie, sorry, Susie, you're done. Has the needle moved over the years based upon them reviewing and reacting to the data that you and I and others have put out throughout the world?
Yeah, and that's such a gratifying part of all of this, is that we have been able to move the needle a little bit. So for at this point, so there was a new set of guidelines, of recommendations that came out just a couple of years ago, and the guidelines really did change. So it used to be, the way we thought about things was either a yes or no. Like, you would look up a certain condition, and if you had it, you're in. If you had a different condition, you're out. And that was the whole thing. Now, for a number of these types of conditions, so based on the data from the ICD registry, people with ICDs, based on data from Mike and some other long QT researchers for individuals with long QT, and some of the other channelopathies as well, sports are now considered something that may be considered for this group, as opposed to the no way, no how that we had before. And so I think seeing the needle start to move has just been great. One of the things that's really important that we haven't talked about yet is that what makes exercise something we can consider or I should say sports, something that we can consider for these populations, is that the conditions are well treated. So the fact that the needle is moved doesn't mean like, oh, now we don't have to think about it at all. But what it does mean is that for people who are well treated for their long QT, their HCM, their defibrillators, by doctors that really are specialists in these fields and know when these types of things are adequately treated, that often these sports participation can be safe.
Yeah, and I think with that, you mentioned some really important things, like who's evaluating that athlete, what's their diagnosis, what's their treatment plan, what's the family's understanding and tolerance and acceptability of non-zero risk, and getting everybody on the same page. But now I personally don't feel like I'm practicing rogue any longer, because I'm actually well within guidelines. I was outside of guidelines for 15 years, then wrote the guidelines to have it read a very different message than what we had been in for most of our career, which means it's a new day for so many of our families, where now there's a chance that little Johnny and little Sally won't be told no at age 6, might actually get really, really good at his or her sport. And we might start to see in the very near future athletes with our genetic heart conditions making it all the way to the professional ranks and to the Olympics. And that's going to be new for us, because it's hard for anybody to get good at sports when from year 2000 to just recently, the door has been closed. They've been put in the penalty box of life and told, take up crochet, or don't get your heart rate above 70 when you get up off the couch.
Yeah, I think it's really nice to see that we know we can now be so much more encouraging. And there are other factors to take into consideration, as you started to bring up. We don't think of all entities the same, but I think it's for many of them now, we can have a very different type of conversation.
Yeah, Dean's offering for his daughter with long QT syndrome, type 1 long QT syndrome, is just a year old. And your daughter will have a rich and active life, Dean. I can't wait to see and learn what she gets to do. The world's her oyster. And I actually saw an LQT1 patient just this week, and she has a really good chance of making it to Summer Olympics 2024, Paris, France, in LQT1 and competitive swimming. So things are changing. But I don't want to make it sound like we just let everybody do whatever they want, no matter what, Rachel. So let's answer Deidre's question and come back to that one, because it isn't a one size fits all. And for Deidre and her family, they are an ARVC family. And Deidre's daughter has ARVD, and she's been told no activity, 0, because it can lead to progression of her disease. As a consequence of listening to that recommendation, she now has gained 15 pounds, has high cholesterol, and Deidre's asking, how on earth do we find a balance here? She is not a healthy or enjoyable, not experiencing a healthy or enjoyable life as a teenager. So maybe discuss a little bit about how confident we are in HCM and long QT, but we're not where we want to be with when the disease is called ARVC.
Yeah, I think with ARVC, we have some idea about the extremes. So marathons are probably not a good idea for the ARVC patient. We do have some data coming out of Hopkins that like a lifelong or many years of endurance exercise may worsen the cardiomyopathy of ARVC. We know that like walking 10,000 steps a day is safe, but where that line is, how much exercise is safe for ARVC, we don't know yet. We know you don't have to sit on the couch. I think that everybody needs to get off the couch. And it's looking like at least a little bit of sports that are maybe not that rowing, swimming, heavy endurance sports may be okay. But it's a place we don't know, and it's a place we may go with the next iteration of LIVE, actually, to try to get that data to really understand how much, where do we need to draw that line.
And can you give, and I totally agree, that's the one lesion where I think good, accurate, shared decision making ought to result in an ARVC marathoner giving up his or her sport.
Yeah.
That we can't just say, I've discussed everything with you, but if you still want to do the marathon, I'll support it, because we actually know that kind of sport for that specific disease could be disease accelerating. And I think we tailor our discussion, but I think the 0 dose recommendation of activity, we've got to do somewhere better between 0 dose and saying no to triathlons.
Right. And where that line is, it's one of the most important questions that we have right now.
And speaking of moving the line and moving the goalposts, I've always said, Rachel, that for many of our diseases, if the goal is preventing sudden death, we've set the bar so low that that's really easy now, because when we know of these diseases, we have great therapies like you mentioned. So we've tried to move the goalposts for these diseases where it's not about preventing sudden death any longer. It's about how do I live and thrive, really thrive, despite having this diagnosis. And for some of our patients, part of thriving is their sport. Their sport is just oxygen to them. It defines who they are. And so Leilani, I hope I said that right, Leilani. My mom's first name is Leah. She's wondering, how can they keep up on where are the studies? And Victoria told them, look it up on the SADS Foundation website under research, but maybe give Leilani a sneak peek into some of tomorrow's knowledge. Like, what is a soundbite of something that you know and have seen in the data that nobody else has seen in the world yet, almost like a teaser as something that excites you from the data you're studying?
Well, so we really truly don't know the results yet. We don't know, we haven't pulled in all the endpoints, so we really can't start to compare them. But one thing that really struck me as we were kind of going through the baseline results, which basically is asking the question, who's in this study? And that data has been presented at some meetings, although it's not in published form yet. But one of the exciting things is the number of different types of things that these people are doing that are in the study. So they're doing so many different kinds of sports and activities. And something that I was kind of excited to see were how many people were doing occupations that have often, or in some situations, people have doubts about as well. So we have, all kinds of policemen and firemen and people really pursuing occupations that are what they want to do. And I thought really seeing the range of things people are doing that have long QT and HCM really has been very exciting.
And what about with the ICD Sports Registry? You've continued to monitor that, and I know you've continued to see the data. Anything that's been reinforced from the original data set, or some new observation that our audience can be the first to hear of it?
Well, let's see. So unfortunately, we were only able to follow the patients for about 4 years. And then, we just didn't have the funding anymore to continue to follow them the way we are with LIV. Actually, with LIV, even after you finish the 3 years, we'll sign you up for another stint. But with the ICD Sports Registry, one thing we have had the opportunity to do is some sub-analyses, which is to kind of use that data to look at some other questions. So a couple things we found that one of the things people were always concerned about was whether you're going to hurt the system, were you going to damage the ICD with sports? And so we were able to look at that in more detail and really found that that was really not a problem, that we had worried about it a lot. But comparing it to populations of ICD patients that aren't athletes, they really weren't having higher rates of problems with their devices. We've also looked at how to program the ICD in a way to minimize the chance that it will go off. And that's something else I think that's really been helpful moving forward. We're just now starting to look at the subgroups. We've looked at the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy group and really found that's a group that actually didn't have more episodes with sports at all. And actually the long QT group didn't either. It was some of the other entities did. Yeah.
And so I'll give our audience a little teaser. I can't tell you anything yet, but the embargo gets lifted in 18 days. July 27, we have a major paper of ours coming out in Journal of American College of Cardiology, one of the largest, highest impact factor cardiology journals in the world, on our 20-year experience of all of my athletes with genetic heart conditions. And I've had the privilege, I suspect that I probably follow more athletes with genetic heart conditions than almost anybody in the world. And all I'll tell everyone is the results are built on what we published in JAMA in 2011, and they're very, very encouraging. There is nothing that has made me change my philosophy that it is our families and athletes' right to participate in their return to play and get to return to play. So much so that I want to finish, Rachel, with you reacting to this comment of mine and see if you think I'm off the deep end. But I am so confident with long QT and HCM, we're going to keep ARVC away for a moment, that if there were to be a high school, university, or a professional league that would disqualify the athlete because of the presence of that genetic heart condition, I'm ready to call that genetic discrimination, and I'm ready to call that a violation of Americans with Disability Act. Am I too off the end, or do you think our data now supports going that strong with that kind of conclusion?
Well, so I think if we're talking data, we're absolutely there for a defibrillator. We're absolutely there for the channelopathies, for long QT, the other channelopathies. Without having, I think with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, I think we're going to end up there. And certainly the current guidelines that just came out last year for HCM also support shared decision-making for this population. I think when we're thinking about shared decision-making, we always have to talk about how much data there is. You know, are we talking about making a decision in the context of really knowing the answer? Or are we thinking about how do we make a decision given the fact that we don't have all the data that we might want? So I think for long QT, for the ICD, absolutely. I think if for a school or an institution to sideline that person would not be consistent with either the data or the guidelines. And right now for HCM, I'm looking for, I think we have a little more data to gain, but certainly the guidelines would not support restriction of that person either.
And I think the other thing to add, and then I'll give you the final word on what has been a wonderful 30 plus minutes together, is I think the professional organization bodies, at least in the United States, NFL, NBA, Major League Baseball, soccer, I don't want to leave anybody out, WNBA, women's, they kind of have voted with their feet, haven't they, with their acceptance of non-zero risk by the whole way that they've conducted themselves during this pandemic. I mean, after all, for a year, we didn't know exactly what the risk might be of all of these athletes in the setting of this virus. And yet the answer was, we'll let every one of them stay in play in this non-zero risk environment. I think it's fascinating to me that now we know the data. The data was just like some of us, like here, and me and a few others said a year ago, this is not going to be a spooky interaction between athletes and this virus. It's going to be safe, but we didn't really know that. But the very fact that these bodies, these professional sports organizations, have been willing to subject every one of their athletes to a non-zero risk proposition reinforces that there's a willingness to accept that we live in a non-zero risk world. And that ought to translate over to our athletes who have their heart conditions diagnosed, risk stratified, and treated well, to let them stay and play or let them return to play. Final, what say you, Dr. Rachel Lampert, on all of that?
I just say I hope you're right. I hope you're right, because I think it really is the way we need to go as a society, is to allow people to make these decisions for themselves.
Agree. Well, I hope we can invite you back and you'll join us when we put out the first result paper from both lives. Yeah. And we can answer Dana's question. And again, because of them and for them participating in LIVE, like the other 3,000 individuals have across the United States and world, we'll be sure to have you back if you come back, for you to give them the answers to what we've learned from their participation.
Well, I really look forward to that, Mike. Thanks so much for inviting me today.
Great to have you. And for all of you, Aaron out there in SADS Space Foundation staff land, thanks for the amazing job that you did once again. Remember, everyone, we're taking next week off, so get used to the 2-week thing. And on July 23rd, I have the privilege of introducing to you the winners, the next generation of the Young Investigator awardees for this year's SADS Foundation PACES Heart Rhythm Society competition. I look forward to congratulating them and presenting them to you. And then for the rest of the 30 minutes, we'll take any and all of your questions, including some really good ones that you guys put forward today that Rachel and I just didn't get a chance to touch on. So until 2 weeks from now, be well, everyone. Stay well. Stay SARS-CoV-2 infection free. And if you haven't gotten the vaccine yet, and unless there's a good reason not to, get the jab and get it done. So take care, everyone.